In the 1930s, people doubted whether democracy would hold. There was a broad question about whether free societies could compete with the alleged efficiency of totalitarian nations.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, and I'm joined, as always, on this podcast by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And What Could Go Right is our weekly podcast where we talk to people, some of whom members of the Progress Network, some not, but all who are animated by a spirit of and a sensibility of what could go right. How do we solve the problems we have rather than wallow in them? How do we deal with our dysfunctions rather than assume that we are stuck in them in perpetuity? And clearly one of the things that society is most dyspeptic about is political partisanship. Political divisions are nothing new, although I think our sense that there is no mid-ground has become increasingly acute. But some of that is based on a degree of historical myopia, failure to recognize that we've been here before, that we've muddled through. And as they say in finance, while past performance is no guarantee of future results, the fact that we have indeed been mired in intensely animosity-driven politics in the past should be some indication that we may not be as in bad a way as we think we are today. So we're going to talk today to someone who has an acute sense of both the past and a pulse on the present. Emma, who are we going to talk to?
So today we're going to talk to John Avlon, who's a senior political analyst and fill-in anchor at CNN. Before that, he was editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast. And he's also the author of a book called Lincoln and the Fight for Peace.
So we're going to turn to politics and culture and history. And I think we're going to have a really, really good conversation. Mr. Avlon, so good to have you here. Let's start in the past before we make our way to the present and speculate about the future. You and I have talked about this a lot over the years, and so I'm going to just posit the following, that people's negativity about the current state of American politics in particular is, if you peel back some of the assumptions, predicated on a belief that there used to be some sort of bipartisan consensus where everybody obeyed Marquess of Queensberry rules and said, you, sir, I may, and it was always men. So in this case, the sir makes sense. You, sir, I may disagree with, but you are a true American and I shall work with you even as I object to your inherent political beliefs. And they would nod, genuflect genially in the direction.
Yes, your obedient servant. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. So tell us, having written about a period of time where I think at least most Americans recognize things got pretty bad pretty quickly in the Civil War.
That's one way to say it.
How things were compared to now, and if in fact this belief of, oh my God, things are never been so bad is based on a kind of a misread of how bad they have been and could
be. That's a literal fundamental misread of American history, and that's one of the many reasons to read about the Civil War and its aftermath that definitively has been worse than it is today. You don't get any worse than a civil war in which 750,000 Americans died. But it's also a warning about the forces that lead to deepening division that can spill over into violence, which is primarily the dangers of tribal politics. What I've spent a lot of my writing, both as a journalist and in books, warning about, which is the dangers of hyperpartisanship and polarization. But it does no good to catastrophize the present or to be pessimistic. In fact, I think that's a perfectly useless way to meet the challenges that we all inevitably face. There is no perfect past. This mythologizing of this idea that the past, America in the recent past was better and simpler and more united. There are ways to measure, for example, congressional bipartisanship, and there was a period of broad unity from roughly the Second World War through the early 1960s. But that was about a lot of different structural factors. In fact, there were liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats. There were a lot of searing experiences like the Second World War that brought people together. But when people get overwhelmed by the challenges of the present, I lose a lot of patience because the future is always uncertain, because it's unwritten. And the idea that you are going to think so highly of yourself that to say that you live in unprecedentedly terrible times, that's just being part of a doomsday cult. It does nothing to actually solve problems, and it doesn't take any of the advantages of being alive into account. So, buck up and deal with the difficulties we've got. They're serious, but they're in no way, shape, or form worse than anything we've faced in the past.
Okay, so how would you recommend us, bucking up and dealing with the realities? Like for some reason, when I was preparing for this episode, I kept on thinking of like the Humpty Dumpty nursery rhyme, and it's like, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? And so I'm
Well,
gonna pose it like that.
I would counter with the, Leonard Cohen, everything's broken, but that's where the light gets in, or various Japanese poetry or pottery metaphors.
I know that one.
Everyone's always a bit broken. So society, we are facing very serious challenges. I don't want to diminish those. I just want to caution against catastrophizing, because there is this sort of millennial, like, the world is ending, woe is me. Uh, that sort of reeks of some weird combination of self-importance and impotence. It's really useless.
I mean, I wonder whether the whole, you mentioned the 1950s, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it feels like there's this odd cultural, like 1945 is America's Thermidor year one, the French Revolution, where just everybody reset history from now forward, as if we created this marker of the greatest generation, and people came back from the war, and everybody had a college education because of the GI Bill, and everybody had a home because of Levittown and suburbs, and a car, and look, the United States was 50% of global manufacturing in 1945, and an inordinate percentage of political coherence, just because of the devastation that World War II had on the traditional centers in Europe, and certainly China and Asia. Like it's not the right starting point for the conversation, and yet it seems to inform the left and the right. I mean, we've talked about this on the show before, Em and I. The left mythologizes the 60s, the right mythologizes the 50s, and everybody mythologizes something that is no longer real, and it wasn't even what we think it was then.
Yeah, this is part of my impatience. People, you have whole political movements about taking America back to where it was. Usually, people root it sometime in their childhood, and the world wasn't simpler then. You were, you know, trying to recreate some idealized America reflects your own childhood, literally childish perceptions of what the world was like when you were a kid. To the adults, then it was actually completely imbued with uncertainty and difficulty. And you're right, there was a high water mark, 1946. I would mark it 1947. We were making the world anew. The U.S. was in pole position because we had cobbled together a winning coalition of allies, but the war had not been fought on our soil. But by the 1950s, there was broad dissatisfaction reflected in the Beat Generation, and obviously, there were whole areas where segregation, lack of fundamental civil rights, lack of you know fundamental ways that people would work together and enjoy the kind of striving for equality and liberty that we have achieved since. So idealizing the past is always wrong. I mean, there was 90% taxation in the 1950s. One of the many reasons the conservative fascination with that time, I think, is fundamentally misplaced.
Although
So,
although no one paid those rates.
Nobody paid those rates. But I mean, this is one of my, when I wrote Wingnuts in out of reporting of the early days of the Tea Party movement in 2009 and 2010, is a book about extremism in American politics. Out of reporting at that time, but looking at the echoes and the antecedents, right? So, if you want to understand Glenn Beck at that time, you need to understand the John Birch Society. Obama's policies, were not that far off from Eisenhower's in many respects, and that's where I think history becomes a really useful comp. I'm really passionate about applied history, but I think it's about applying it. It's useful wisdom that we can apply to the present. And one of the things that history teaches us is don't give up, don't catastrophize, think practically, try to figure out the larger trends, figure out what's really worked in the past to help us be our best selves and continue that process of forming a more perfect union. The idea that we should somehow are entitled to a perfect present is totally ahistorical and nonsense.
I mean, I think the elephant in the room for a lot of people when they listen to a conversation like this about, don't catastrophize is like, but Trump, like Trump
Yeah,
is the, the big galactic warship coming to wreck democracy. And for some
yeah.
people, what I just said is overstated, and for some people, it's completely not, right? Yeah, I mean, what
We've
do we do with
never
him?
had anyone. We well, um, the future is as yet unwritten. But I'll so a couple things. Um, Look, Donald Trump is unlike anything we've dealt with at the level of the presidency before. We've had demagogues before in American history, but they've been governors or senators at most. Um, Donald Trump is a classic demagogue. He's a professional divider, driven primarily by his own ego. And the thing that should be indelible is he tried to overturn an American election on the basis of a lie solely to stay into power. If that's not disqualifying, nothing. And yet, as we speak, he should be recognized as the front runner for the Republican nomination, which is insane from a patriotic principles above party, country above party perspective. I mean, George H.W. Bush couldn't get a second look from the Republican Party, in 1996. That wasn't on the menu, just to use one example of a one-term president. And this is the problem of hyperpartisanship and polarization that I think is at the root of a lot of the rot we're dealing with right now. That is a really serious problem without any clear historical precedent. So I'm not minimizing that at all. And I think we all need to think differently about how to confront it. But we also need to think systemically and structurally, by which I literally mean rules of the game. 2 books ago, I wrote a book on Washington's farewell address, George Washington's farewell address. And he basically, his farewell address is this: he's writing a letter to future generations of Americans, warning about the forces that have destroyed democratic republics in the past. And the one he spends the most time on is what we would call hyperpartisanship, what the founders would call faction. That's the number one thing that had destroyed democratic republics in the past. So when I get fired up about the fact that this is dangerous, this isn't just some playful narcotic or teamism in politics. This is gone. This is exactly what the founders warned about. And so that's an example of applying history and carrying it forward. But this is in terms of a president wielding the power of the presidency and the checks and balances that the founders set up breaking down because people were willing to, in Congress, they were willing to put the interests of this one person over their own institutional loyalty as a balancing power. That's a very different problem. And while the founders did contemplate how do you deal with tyrants, how do you constrain power, that was a lot of their thinking. They didn't quite anticipate this flavor. And so we should feel an enormous amount of urgency around that. Don't get me wrong. But we should also say, for all our difficulties, this is not as bad a time as the founding era. It's not as bad a time as the Civil War. In the 1930s, people doubted whether democracy would hold. That was part of the large conversation in the 1930s before our involvement in the Second World War. We weren't only dealing with the First America First movement, isolationists, but there was a broad question about whether free societies could compete with the alleged efficiency of totalitarian nations. That was like the large topic of conversation, for over a decade. And then we belatedly found out that backs to the wall, free people can draw on strengths that totalitarian nations can't. And we shouldn't have to relearn those lessons. But we shouldn't also overestimate the strengths of our opponents either.
With every ounce of heart and might and sweat and soul, we're going to keep making America great again. And then we will indeed keep America great. And that is why tonight I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States. Thank you.
You said earlier quite eloquently, and certainly I agree with, because I've tried to say some of the same things less eloquently, that the future is unknown territory, and therefore we shouldn't be so certain about its outcomes. If Trump is the nominee, and which it would seem likely, but who knows, right? Things could intercede.
There's a long time between then and now. Also, we could talk about the 12th Amendment. We could talk about the 14th Amendment, Section 3, if you really want to nerd out. But will go
Right,
to
but
that.
someone would have to then actually enforce it, and with the
Yes.
court, right? I mean,
Still, it's in the Constitution. I don't know why this seems so difficult. Go on.
but there is the famous Andrew Jackson line about John Marshall, and he said the Supreme Court has made its ruling, now let it enforce it. So you have all sorts of issues about who enforces what. And
Yes.
I am wondering, given your perch as a card-carrying member of the current mainstream media, whether
I don't even think that's a thing
there's,
you carried a card
there's
for.
no card. I get that.
Yeah.
There's a metaphorical one.
I'm a card carrying centrist. That's true.
My card has been. I don't know if I've renewed my current card.
No, I think you're in arrears. We were going to talk.
I think I'm in arrears, so I'll have to take that up with the appropriate authorities.
Yeah.
Have we learned anything from the way that Trump was covered? In that, I believe honestly there is a legitimate backlash in many parts of the country that basically held their nose and voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. You know, they were given two choices. Now, from the perspective of people who think Trump is kind of the clear and present danger, there is no excuse to vote for him, right? There's sort of an absolutism around that. But for the 70 plus million who voted for them, there clearly had to have been tens of millions of people who did so for all sorts of reasons that were basically in spite of him, not because of him, but who also felt like that viewpoint had no purchase, was completely dismissed. And then you add to the mix the degree to which Trump gets ratings. So I guess I'm wondering, what can one learn from what has been about how to do this again?
From a coverage standpoint, look, I think that was a question that I think the media wrestled with in the wake of 2016 as well, right? I mean, one thing I think you learned is how not to do balanced coverage is to put two people on. You have to insist on a fact-based debate, right? You can't have one person saying, here are facts, the other person spouting non-facts, and then say, you decide. That's not actually, adding, that may add heat, it doesn't add light. And the reason there's a deeper civic purpose to all this is, as Washington said, enlightened opinion is necessary to a self-governing society. Enlightened shouldn't be taken with any sense of congratulation. It's simply fact. It's the Moynihan quote that I've considered the key quote of our time, even though it was uttered decades ago. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own fact. And so that's essential. Understanding why people voted for Donald Trump the first time in 2016, and then to some extent in 2020, realizing that he lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million the first time, a relevant point. It seems to me. Yeah, everyone's got their reasons, and some of them are predicated upon fear of the far left. I think the far left has a certain blind spot about why. I mean, there at any given point there are twice as many self-identified conservatives in this country as self-identified liberals. Right, the number of people who identify as very liberal is a fraction of the people who call themselves liberal. And one of the things about asymmetric polarization is that the far left has cultural influence. The far right has very real and tangible political influence. They're different. But pumping up fears about the far left as a cultural irritant is enormously effective at galvanizing folks, because a lot of times folks on the far left seem utterly out of touch with what most Americans would regard as common sense reality. And that is a recipe for political backlash, even if it doesn't actually represent the actual policy beliefs of people at the top of the Democratic Party, the presidency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that requires a degree of humility, it requires a degree of empathy. That's one of the many things you can learn from Lincoln. His ability to retain empathy in the middle of a civil war is one of the magisterial things about his reconciliation-oriented leadership. But you also have to look at, for example, I think the hollowing out of the middle class being squeezed for decades in this country has led to a hollowing out of the middle of our political spectrum as well. That hasn't given us as much ballast as we had in the past. The Republican Party, rhino hunting its way into having very few moderate Republicans. also means that party is more susceptible to being taken over by its more extreme wings, compounded by media fragmentation, the rise of hyperpartisan media, the rigged system of redistricting, which means that, there are only, 35, 40 genuinely competitive seats in Congress, which means that, extremes are always going to have the edge in these closed partisan primaries. All those things conspire to electing a Donald Trump, or having a Donald Trump-like figure get the nomination. And you see it, people who want to replace him playing to the base with policies that are probably unpopular in their state, but they think will give them an edge with the activist class. And the disproportionate influence of those special interests is what I think frustrates so many folks. But it's legitimately dangerous in terms of creating representative government. The larger stakes, I think, as to draw a circle around the two topics you raised, is one thing Biden's absolutely right about is that the defining struggle of our time is between democracies and autocracies. And one of the things autocracies try to do is delegitimize democracy by making people think there's not that much difference, that it's dysfunctional, that it doesn't get things done. And whenever we undercut our own democracy or dismiss it, or people sow doubts about its honesty, or polarization means we can't address problems in a proactive manner, that ends up feeding right into that larger geopolitical narrative that we absolutely positively have to stand up and push back against.
John, can you tease out a little bit, I think the tie or the tension or the confusion between empathy and tolerance, meaning that it seems to have been popular, particularly in the Trump area, that like showing empathy to people that have a different political opinion to you is somehow okaying their stance, or like you're being tolerant in a bad way. There was that, Tucker Carlson being out of Fox News, right? Was huge news not too long ago. And one thing about some of the texts that were leaked, there was the highly racist remark, right? Which was gross. Like white men don't fight like that. Okay, nasty. And then the whole rest of his text was like weirdly empathetic, right? That it was
Yeah, I'm actually that's very fair of you to put it in the larger context, because it was actually interesting.
Yeah, because I think people didn't expect that from Tucker Carlson, right? Like the whole rest of his text was like, I saw this Antifa guy and he shouldn't have been beat up like that. And, aren't we all human beings? And it seemed to me like maybe this is like the height of Pollyannish or naivete, to think like, wow, okay, if even Tucker Carlson thinks like that, like we do have some hope for proper empathy returning to the American public, and it actually being okay to express empathy towards people that don't think like us.
Well, it's essential because, democracy depends upon, well, an assumption of goodwill among your fellow citizens, even if people you disagree with, right? I think that the problem with Tucker's sort of self-check in the back half of that text or email was that it was at odds with what he did on air, as we saw was a pretty consistent theme with his text and email. And particularly if you're in the media and if you've got a perch like that, primetime, number one primetime show, you are 100% responsible with what you say when you have the microphone. And I'm not talking about the inevitable stumbles or, live TV is full of people choosing, an infelicitous word. No, I'm talking about the consistent themes you hit, especially if they are at odds with what you actually believe. But ultimately what he was expressing is, I started to feel myself falling in with the mob. And that's bad for my soul and for society. And that's obviously right. One of the things I think that true liberal values, not in a partisan sense, the impulse should always be to stand up against the mob and to defend individual rights, and to do so with a degree of empathy. The other point I think you make in the distinction between empathy and tolerance is, our empathy has been strained, and it's very difficult to do in a situation where people are being motivated by fear of different groups that is impervious to facts, or bad faith, right? They know they're lying. That's very, very difficult to deal with. And yet, if Lincoln was able to retain that degree of empathy in the middle of a civil war, we can at least try. But people are being fed an enormous amount of bad information.
There's no question, and it's been widely reported that there was widespread fraud and irregularities across this country. We never had the opportunity to have common sense hearings on that, or any evidence that we could, actually see, because it was swept under the bus.
Many of us were warning about the fact that the Democrats unilaterally, fundamentally altered our voting system inside 90 days. We warned that the state of Nevada was just simply not ready to give us a fully fair and secure election.
If I was a United States Senator on the day of the certification, I would have stood with Senator Cruz and Senator Scott and that small handful of senators who had the courage to stand up and say, wait, let's hold up on the certification of this election.
And at this point, if anybody still thinks, forget the 63 court federal judges that said the election wasn't, stolen or tampered with in any way. The text messages and emails by the people pumping up this stuff on air, the audits paid for by these folks, including the Trump campaign that said there was no there there. If they still believe that, they have been willfully duped by someone who has a vested interest in spreading that lie because his ego is more important than America or the Constitution, or a fact-based reality. That's a really challenging situation, and I've looked a lot at cult deprogramming is difficult to do, or de-radicalization is more an accurate term. It's difficult to do at scale. It's easier done one-on-one, where the general path is you form a bond, you remind people, you get them out of that immediate feedback loop, you remind them of their alleged values, and then lead them to recognize the contradiction between their alleged values, because everyone needs to think they're good on some level, what they're actually doing, or what the people they're actually following. But that's hard to scale, in a very, very real sense. But I think that's why ultimately this isn't a situation that's going to be solved for us by a single leader. It's going to take more people to step up as citizens, as lower level political leaders. The Republican Party has a unique responsibility right now, I think, to do that. Senators, governors, mayors, some people are stepping up and speaking out. But the stakes are much bigger than the future of the Republican Party, right? I mean, they're as big as they get for our democratic republic. So now is, and people are, let's be honest, the power of fear and greed, which is the heart of all of this, is much more powerful than we thought. By fear, I mean fear of Donald Trump, fear of the base, fear of being rebuked, fear of being cast out if you speak truth to power, and greed, because a lot of people, the partisan economy is massive, how they make a living. And that's a deeply corrupting factor. They're afraid that if they speak out and tell the truth, they will burn their bridges and they will be functionally unemployable. But these are sort of biblical admonition. Don't let fear and greed make decisions for you. It never ends well. And that is, but that's what we're facing. It's not difficult to see how history will look at Donald Trump.
I mean, the question about hyperpartisanship is that it does go both ways. Now, one of the things that we look at in terms of the Civil War,
it's a feedback loop,
because the North won, is we treat the hyperpartisanship of the South defending slavery as morally wrong, and we treat the hyperpartisanship of the Republican Party determined to, at least in 1860, to halt the spread of slavery. There was no actual determination in the mainstream Republican Party in 1860 to abolish slavery.
Well, not by Lincoln's part. I mean, there were leaders in the Republican Party who wanted to.
Correct, but I mean, there wasn't. That was not the governing platform at the time. It was to halt the spread. It was not to abolish.
That's right.
So we treat that hyperpartisanship as legitimate and moral, and kind of on the quote unquote the right side of history, right?
Okay, I'm grudgingly going along with you for the point of argument. Go on.
I think that the challenge today is, again, I'm going to push you on this.
Great.
Distinguishing people who vote for the Republican Party and for Trump, of which there are tens of millions, from fully endorsing the viewpoints of the people they're voting for, because in many of these places, there's not a lot of optionality, and there's not a lot of the partisanship of policy has become significant, right? I mean, there are plenty of people who will vote for the Republican Party. I mean, look, even the fact that I'm talking about it this way, clearly, we know where we line up politically, the three of us, who will do so because they are deeply unsatisfied with immigration policy and that they perceive the Democrats of having done. Immigration has been a morass for decades. There was one brief moment under Obama that there was going to be a grand bargain about immigration that fell apart. Obviously, the country would have been better off.
Yeah. Okay.
So what do you? I mean, again, there's got to be a way of like. It's like the art from the artist kind of thing. There's like plenty of people who are terrible human beings whose art appreciate. I mean, I wrote a piece, I think, at one point in early 2020 saying, if Trump says it, does that mean it's wrong? Right? Meaning there's plenty of things that are animating legitimate debate in this country, including immigration, that lead people to vote certain ways.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot there, but let's break it down. First of all, I think it's really important to put things in perspective so that we don't fall into what my fellow centrists are often criticized of doing, sort of a both sides, moral equivalence deal, which is exactly what I'm saying. In particular, we shouldn't do with democracy on the world stage. One of the stats that I crunched a while ago that I like a lot is I think there were 7 members of the current Democratic caucus in the House last session who supported the policy known as defund the police. It's the world's single dumbest policy branding ever, or most self-defeating. And 167 Republicans who voted to overturn the election after the attack on the Capitol. So I would that's useful, it seems to me, just statistically, to ground things. Now, of course, you're right. People can have honestly different policy differences, and too often policy differences get demonized in our conversations. I happen to be a big believer that broken windows theory of policing and as understood by James Q. Wilson, and civic order is enormously important. And I think a lot of the decay in cities is what causes a lot of popular and populist frustration that I think is understandable. And saying that, no, broken windows theory is a good idea. Some people will be quick reflexively, to say, well, that's a racist policy. Well, it's not. And calling people racist when there's a policy disagreement is fundamentally not useful, it seems to me. Not a hominem attack. American politics works best when we debate different approaches to solving the same problem, right? We have common problems in the country, urban and rural areas. There have always been cultural and political differences about the challenges they face, but okay. And let's debate that. Let's again have an honest debate about, say, immigration. So Ronald Reagan was the last person to sign a comprehensive immigration plan into place, and it offered amnesty for existing undocumented workers, but it didn't sufficiently stop the flow, which is a geopolitical problem as well as a U.S. border problem. Under Obama, as you say, I mean, there was a gang of 12 senators who knew that there was a comprehensive package that needed to be done to deal with this. You needed increased border security. You need E-Verify. You need a pathway to citizenship, on and on and on. And you could tweak that. You could tweak that about, incentivizing assimilation in a way that we're perhaps not doing, that I think is at the root of a lot of, popular frustration. And wanting to control your border is not a wacky idea. And indeed, you can go back and look at past Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton's, I think, 95 State of the Union, where he sounds like a Republican today, quote unquote. But what happened is that Boehner wanted to do that, the immigration deal, and then Eric Cantor, his deputy, lost a primary, and they said they blamed it on immigration, and the entire party got cowardly and ran the other way. And a lot of people would rather demagogue issues than deal with them, even if everybody actually knows what needs to be done and could be done. And Biden himself has basically said, I'm happy to be much tougher on border security with dollars if we can come up with something comprehensive, which is actually needed to solve the plan. So yeah, as long as we can have a fact-based debate, I think that policy empathy is a lot easier. I wrote a column Christmas, I think, probably year 2 or 1 of the Trump presidency, where I said, look, here are 5 issues where I agree with Donald Trump, policies that he's put in place. They're relatively small targeted things, but I thought that was an important gesture, right? To make the exact point that I think you're making.
Yes.
They're very small in the grand scheme of who Donald Trump is, but now you've got a larger binary choice. You can't say I like low taxes because individual tax rates haven't been rated. Therefore, I'm going to reelect someone who tried to overturn an election on the basis of a lie. There's a limit to which that policy rationalization works, it seems to me, because the larger challenge to really basic patriotic principles is so stark in the form of that person.
I agree with the presumption, except for the fact that 3 million people did. I can't remember the exact vote count. 74, was it 74? I
want to be clear. That was before he tried to overturn an election on the basis of a lie.
So let's say
he was telegraphing that he would do that.
I mean, look, we'll see if he gets the nomination, but I do think one of the things I think we have not adequately dealt with is how do you grapple with what seem to be completely opposed perspectives in a democracy. Abortion rights clearly is a huge issue in this because there's an absolutism about
good example
women's rights, and to some degree, Donald Trump has become that. It's it doesn't seem fully reconcilable to most people on either side of that, and so I guess what I find to be our failing democratically is confronting what feels to be irreconcilable differences. And you're right to point to the Civil War as a moment where maybe there was no way to reconcile the morality of slavery, the immorality of slavery, the untenableness of slavery as both an economic and human system with an open democracy. And therefore, either that was going to be peacefully abolished, as it was in Britain and a lot of European countries, or it was going to be forcefully abolished. One of the two, right? There was no pathway of half free, half slave. So maybe you're right. Maybe this is one of those, but I don't know what to do about that.
But no, again, first of all, I mean, the problem of slavery was much bigger than anything we're dealing with today, right now. And remember, the international slave trade was abolished in 1808 by agreement of the founding fathers. The notes in the articles, the notes of the Constitutional Convention come out in the 1840s, I believe. And people are able to see that the founders basically said, okay, we're not going to be able to get agreement to pass the Constitution. So we're not going to be able to deal with slavery. We recognize that it's a fundamental problem existentially for the nation. It's a contradiction to all men are created equal, but we'll put it on a pathway towards extinction. So then after the Mexican-American War, when there's a structural shift and all of a sudden you have new slave states being added, that upsets the apple cart, right? That's a structural shift. And it was an alleged compromise at the time. And that's what elevates the issue. And brings it to sort of a boil, so to speak. And the boil occurs when Southern states proactively secede because they don't recognize the legitimacy of Abraham Lincoln's win. And you go back and read the first inaugural address, and he said, look, I am not trying to abolish slavery. I might like that personally, but I don't think I have the constitutional right to do it. Our only disagreement is about whether it should be extended. We must not be enemies. We must be friends, right? Go back and read that whole speech. So it's the preemptive fear that he is going to try to end slavery because he's an abolitionist candidate of a new moderately progressive third party, in effect, that creates the proactive secession and rebellion of the South. So that's really important historical context and understanding how that came about. And then, of course, the war creates the context in which Lincoln can, for the first Emancipation Proclamation and then the passage of the 13th Amendment, to actually end slavery. And Americans' attitudes change over time, in large part to the example set by 180,000 Black Union soldiers. So, that's important because I think it takes it away from the only way to end it was through violent abolition of slavery. There were off-ramps all along the way, but it was the people who were attributing false motivations and didn't recognize the legitimacy of that election that got us here. So if that framing is resonant, it should be. That's not to say there's a parallel. Also, individual states don't have armed militias in the same way that can be set against each other on conventional battlefields. But lost cause mythology is a really pernicious thing. Tribal politics is a really pernicious thing, particularly when you're dealing with something called that I read about in the book called aggressive defensiveness, right? Which is where people are sold this narcotic that says, we have to kill them before they kill us. Some variation of that theme. That's one of the really dangerous things. And that's where the great replacement theory, for example, feeds right into that. There are any number of reasonable, good Republicans who could run, or a handful who are running, who've got deeply conservative beliefs. That's the ironic thing. And Donald Trump is not conservative by any ideological standard, only by a culture war standard. And those conservative alternatives would presumably answer those policy preferences by people who have them. And those policy preferences are totally legitimate, whether you agree with them or disagree. Of course, we can have debates on policy. That's what democracy is about. But you don't catastrophize losing an election. And yes, because of what Trump did after the last election, in particular, which validated all the worst fears and concerns about him from a follow the Constitution, fitness for office standpoint, that I think puts him in a different category. It seems to me, but that doesn't delegitimize any of those positions that people may have. And Democrats need to do a much better job, in my eyes, of reaching out to voters in rural areas and in red states. Both parties need to be competing. I like it when they're urban Republicans and red state rural Democrats. I think that's healthy. But remember, during the Trump years, the three most popular governors in the country by polling were blue state Republicans. Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, Larry Hogan of Maryland, Phil Scott of Vermont. And in a functioning political system, those would be the world's most obvious political nominees, because they've shown an ability to have supermajority support in states controlled by the other party. And indeed, the residents, citizens of those states are saying, you know what, we need to check on the political culture here in town, not be all from one political party, which is itself a healthy recognition of that balance. But none of those humans have a prayer of getting the Republican nomination. And that speaks to something that's broken structurally. It can be fixed, right? Change the rules, you change the game. You want to stop Donald Trump right now, you have more proportional allocation of delegates, not winner take all. The Republican Party is trying to have, it currently does have more winner take all states. That's a glide path for Donald Trump winning the renomination. You want to stop hyperpartisanship in Congress and polarization? You have more competitive districts by ending the rigged system of redistricting. You can have open primaries, ranked choice voting. There are structural things you can do to change the incentive structures. The incentive structures right now are really out of line with our best traditions and the way that liberal democracies function best. And so that's why we need to be laser-like focused on that, even more than the personalities involved.
I mean, do you see any spots or places in the U.S. where we are seeing movement on that front, or at least focus? Nothing comes to my mind,
Yeah.
so I'm really happy to hear from you
Well,
about it.
no. In New York City, for example, we have ranked choice voting. In Maine, there's ranked choice voting, right? It creates a disincentive. Alaska just passed it. We'll see if it sticks in Nevada, but it creates an incentive in primaries, which, ideally you want to enfranchise independent voters, where you're trying to win over the supporters of your competitors. So you're not trying to destroy them. You're trying to appeal to them with reason. That's a good thing, right? For example. Unfortunately, we're seeing a red state, blue state dichotomy on redistricting. And again, you can't overstate the importance of people trying to have unrepresentative elections, because that's how they feel like they can come into power, right? So in New York and Maryland, Republicans successfully said these maps that Democrats are putting forward are too partisan, it's unfair, and Democratic judges in the case of New York overturned it, and they put a special master map in place for the last election that may get adjusted this election. In Texas, all the growth in congressional seats and population comes from primarily urban areas and voters of color, but they have fewer seats for African American and Hispanic members of Congress. That's being charged under the Voting Rights Act. It's very unclear whether that will go forward. Ron DeSantis pushed through his own plan to maximize the number of seats. If you have states where the registration is roughly 50-50, in Ohio, voters passed a constitutional amendment in 2017 by over 60%, saying that we should have basically nonpartisan maps and contiguous maps, and Republicans overrode it and then ran out the clock. So a state with actually close to 50-50 registration, well, let's be really accurate, independence, so let's say third roughly. I think it's a 13-2 map. That's a real problem. We don't talk about that.
So what could we talk about more that we're not talking about? I mean, is there like a place for good news on
Yeah,
major
good
networks?
news is
Do people tune out? Does it have to be? I mean, the joke used to be
oh,
like that local news would be, fire, murder, death,
mhm. Yeah.
weather,
If it leads,
sports, and
if
then
it bleeds, it
like
leads.
cats and trees, like the last minute, right? And you
Yeah,
don't even get the cats and trees on
yeah.
Fox, CNN, MSNBC.
First of all, don't lump all those networks together. I think it does a disservice after the
Well,
information
meaning
that's coming.
they are representative of where many people, and you don't. I mean, you still do, and like I don't know anyone who watches ABC, CBS, NBC News at night anymore. It's a different cohort. You still do get that last 90-second hit
Mhm.
of the good news at times.
Look, I think it's enormously important. Understanding that news is what's new, and people don't cover trains that arrive on time in stations. Um, and the line that most news organizations don't have a liberal or conservative bias as much as they have a conflict bias, which social media algorithms amplify to our collective detriment. I think there's an enormous need and thirst for good news to remind us that we're not as divided as sometimes feel that we are. Most people are basically good. That's important. The thing I'm really evangelical about within the context of news, you just heard my evangelical rant about the need for election reform, um, so that we have representative elections, so that the extremes don't disproportionately dominate our debate. Um, there are studies that show that so what I call solutions journalism is a way to regain trust. I think a lot of people are exhausted by, and this gets into your core thesis, it seems to me, people are exhausted by this fixation on problems, exquisitely described, without ever offering solutions to how to solve those problems. And I think if news organizations put more emphasis, yes, accountability journalism, but solutions journalism, not saying that any of us have all the answers, but here are some possible solutions. Here are people with ideas on how to solve problems. Elevate those solutions. Have a conversation about how you solve problems. That's what democracy should be much more focused on. It's empowering. It's hopeful. And I've been, quietly, maybe not so quietly, trying to advance that idea, because I think it helps restore trust. But I think it's incredibly important. And I think a lot of journalists are reluctant to talk about solutions because they feel it's overstepping bounds, or they're uncomfortable, frankly, talking about policies. So you get horse race political coverage too much. We should be talking about solutions. I think that's enormously empowering and hopeful. And I think that's why a lot of folks are missing. And in the absence of that, I think folks tune out because it all feels overwhelming and despairing. And that means you're not playing an active enough role as a citizen of a democratic republic.
I mean, what's your own personal strategy for not getting
All of this.
overwhelmed and despairing? I mean, even just in the conversation we just had now, I keep thinking like, how does he keep all this stuff straight in his head? Number one. Number two,
Well, I'm a puzzle. I don't know.
I mean, is that just a personality trait of yours that you can look at all these things and say, but we're not going to give up? Or is that something that you've cultivated over time, with intention?
Oh, I think it's cultivation over time, but it's also about a reading of history that I think, you know, uh, anyone would recognize, or any narrative structure. Of course, you don't give up. There's no points for giving up. But I look, I am a determined optimist, and it's probably partly my um, general perspective. A lot of our greatest and most determined leaders, they fluctuate between sunshine and shadow. Lincoln among them. One of the things I love from my book is he was seen, his faith deepens in the presidency after the death of his son Willie, and he's seen occasionally going into a room and reading the book of Job for comfort, being, quote, oddly cheerful, which is kind of extraordinary. Uh, I'd say there's a certain degree of cultivation from sort of a conscientious nihilism to a determined optimism, but there's a unfortunately apocryphal Lincoln quote. It's one of my favorites, but it's unfortunately apocryphal, where he says allegedly, "I'm an optimist because I don't see the point in being anything else." That seems sort of fairly stable ground. It seems to me. Um, you know, get out of your own way. Don't wallow in your own indecision. The future is always uncertain. It has always been uncertain. That's one reason to read history. that gives you courage and comfort, not least because we know how it turns out.
Mm.
But then look for the opportunities in our time. Look for the areas of need. Try to figure out what needs to be strengthened. What are the big issues of your time? Don't preoccupy yourself with small issues, except as they apply close to home. Children in your home and your community. And there's a lot to be optimistic about. I would love to spend more time talking about the prospects for example, nuclear fusion, or any of the extraordinary things that are happening in health and science and space exploration that could transform humanity. That is not to be Pollyannish at all about the challenges we face, whether they're domestically from a hyperpartisanship and the election denialism and all that stuff, or the geopolitical challenge from authoritarian leaders that range from China's surveillance state to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Those are all real, but look at the galvanizing effect it had. Putin thought he could get away with dividing Ukraine at the very least through a brutal invasion that would be over quickly, and that the will of the West would evaporate, and it was supposed to be a brushback pitch against the expansion of NATO. Well, look what he got in return: an expansion of NATO. The NATO alliance is stronger now because of that challenge. That's a good thing, but I think that's actually a metaphor for how we should all respond.
Well, clearly we could continue the conversation, and probably should at a later point, maybe in 2024. We can circle back and see how this conversation
see how we're
ages.
doing.
Exactly. I think
I do not claim to have a crystal ball. I want to be clear.
I like your sensibility. The historical framework, I think, is important to inform particularly the maelstrom of contemporary news, which can be consumed by the present as if the past doesn't exist and the future is unknown, which it is. So I think it's great that you are both at the heart of that and bring to it that sensibility. I mean, whether that makes its way explicitly into how you think about and talk about things, it is constantly part of who you are and how you think about things. And that, I think, is vital and would be good if everyone had some of that. So keep doing what you're doing, and we will keep talking about it.
We will. And I really appreciate what you guys are doing here. I mean, focusing on the glass half full and the opportunities, and not catastrophizing the inherent uncertainty of the future. That's really good. We need more people talking positively about the potentials for the future, not in a Pollyannish way, but just if you get it sometimes, certainly in your own interior life.
We're doing our best.
Fun talk with you guys. I appreciate it. All right.
Cool.
Thank you so
much. Be
well.
So I'm just going to echo what I said at the end, which is I do think having a degree of historical sensibility that you bring to your view of the present is really vital. Not because I think the past repeats itself mantra is incorrect. Historians repeat each other more than the past repeats itself, but it does give us an awareness of what humans have grappled with, and a degree of offsetting this belief, which is, I think, pretty ubiquitous, that the moment that we're living in is unprecedented and unique. I mean, it is unique, right? Nothing really is the same. But the idea that human beings, having grappled in the past with similar confusions and similar questions, whether that's new technologies. No one has grappled in the past with the rise of artificial intelligence, but people have grappled with new technologies. And how have those been integrated or not integrated or resisted or created confusion? Our political moment is different. And as John talked about, there were things that have gone on during the Trump presidency that haven't really gone on at the center of American politics. But a lot of other things have gone on that are incredibly contentious and incredibly destructive. And how do we meet those? And I think that gives one a degree of perspective. And if anything about the Progress Network that I've tried to do is, it's that take a step back and take a breath. And Emma, I mean, you've been all over that in terms of Buddhist practice, right? Take a moment, take a breath, take a step back. Don't become so consumed in the fear and the agitation and the hysteria of the moment, because that clouds our ability to recognize what moment we're in and grapple with it.
Yeah, and in terms of taking a step back, I like taking the literal step back through history. I think there is some confusion about low points, right? Like that there's an assumption that we're in the lowest point of American history when we're very clearly not. So I'm sure people would respond to that as like, okay, well, if you're going to take the Civil War as the low point, like that's a really low standard. But have not devolved into Civil War. M dash yet is what some people would add to that. But as we were talking, I kept thinking about also just what standards we apply, right, to the present versus the past. There was this really interesting democracy index that came out. I can't remember when, but it was recently, and it rated mostly because of Trump, the quality of United States democracy as lower than it was in the times that women didn't have the right to vote. And you're kind of just like, how could that be possible, right? That the U.S. is being graded now as a lower quality democracy is when not the entire population, half of it, didn't have the right to vote. So that kind of perspective is crucial. That things may be bad and unique and uniquely bad, but they are not insurmountable, and they are not the absolute worst.
And the more people who, I guess, are able to toggle between the very real issues of the present and an awareness of where people have or have not been able to navigate, and also, where their reactions to past problems have aggravated the situation rather than ameliorated it, is also kind of vital. And we've tried to do that in a series of conversations. We're going to keep trying to do that in a series of conversations. Given that we have spent a lot of time talking about a kind of a political news, we're going to eschew our usual news of the week for this one. And not that there isn't our usual stories of things that we haven't been paying attention to that should, which are all in our weekly newsletter that Emma writes, What Could Go Right, which you can sign up for at theprogressnetwork.org or click on a link in Twitter or Facebook. It's free. It comes to you once a week, and it highlights a lot of things that are going on in the world that we may not have paid attention to or just may have missed in the contemporary fray. So urging all of you to sign up for that if you're not already. And thank you all for your time today. And thank you, Emma, for co-hosting as always.
And thank you, Zachary. And we'll be back with the news next week.